I'll tell you a little bit about Lynn. She is an assistant professor at Cornell, the School of Integrated Plant Science. She joined Cornell Agritech in 2019 as an assistant professor of weed ecology and management and specialty crops. Her work includes tree and vine crops in addition to fresh and processing vegetables. She's a native of Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Shamokin. And she earned her PhD in weed science at The Ohio State. She's worked as a research scientist at the University of Georgia, Washington State University, and University of California at Davis. One of her current projects is screening novel products for potential labeling on specialty crops. So with that.
Thanks. I don't have any pictures of Brian, but I have his data, which is a bit more important. Just the question about the tillage and moving seeds deeper. When I was in Georgia working with Palmer Amaranth, we actually did a study where we buried the weed seed at different depths, all the way down to 16 inches below the soil surface. And we did preserve the longevity of those seeds, the deeper we went over time. So over the course of 3 years, the more shallowly buried seeds were, had less viability, whereas the deeper ones, again, there was that stasis and they stayed deeper. And we did do studies where we looked at inversion tillage down in Georgia, where we would flip the seed bank over to try and gain some time from our really heavy weed seed densities. But again, you can only do it once. You know, you've got to go like 5 years or more to let those seeds on the surface die. Because for us, you know, if we flipped it again, we just brought the Palmer Amaranth right back up and we had the same problem that we were dealing with. So we worked it in that we had like a cotton, soy, and peanut rotation, because the peanuts were already going to have digging associated with them. Anyway, but we're going to move on. So why control weeds? There's a lot of reasons. These are my obligatory slides. Obviously yield loss, but also the potential that really large weeds or really high densities can actually reduce your harvest efficiency, because you just can't go through the field as fast. You're going to have to stop for blockages to clear them. And Palmer Amaranth, this is why I'm worried about it, is it will stop a harvester and it will put you down. So parasitism, this is daughter on actually a variety of crops and also on a weed, Russian thistle in the middle. Alternate hosts. Everyone I'm sure is aware of tree of heaven and spotted lanternfly and the association between these two species. They can be hazardous or toxic in their own right, such as groundsel getting in alfalfa and being toxic, stinging nettle, causing problems. This is one out in California. It's called puncture vine. And it does just that. It's got little spikes on it. And I was forever rescuing my husband when he would go bike riding, because he would roll over them and flatten his tires. And then, of course, there's impacts on ecosystem services. I'm pretty sure everyone in the Northeast is really familiar with garlic mustard and it coming into our forested areas. So when should we control weeds? And I'm going to use this in a herbicide context, mostly because I get asked a lot of questions about herbicides, but also because by and large, herbicides are the #1 product that we are using across the United States, across commodities, to manage weeds. So we talk about herbicides and their use patterns based on the timing of when they're applied. Whether they're soil applied, so they're pre-emergence herbicides, and they're meant to suppress the emergence and establishment of weeds, or post-emergence herbicides that are foliar applied, whether they're systemic or contact, and they're meant to control weeds that are already established. Now, there's a lot of other timings. There's the pre-plant burn downs and the pre-plant incorporated or post-directed, whatnot. We're just going to focus on pre and post. Herbicides that are put down to prevent establishment and those to control weeds that are already established. And we're going to start off with the soil applied herbicides. Now, sometimes we are not careful when we are talking about our definitions and we just throw pre-emergence out there. Because sometimes we're using pre-emergence to mean pre-emergent to the crops and the weeds themselves. Or maybe the crop is already standing, and then we're talking about pre-emergent to the weeds. And then sometimes we actually mean pre-emergent to the crop, The crop isn't out of the ground, but we've got weeds up. And this is actually a foliar application to, control the standing vegetation, but sometimes we refer to it as a pre-emergent application. We're not going to talk about this one. We're going to talk about true pre-emergence timings where we want to prevent weed emergence and establishment. So how do pre-emergence herbicides work? A lot of people think that they are soil sterilants. You put it down and the herbicides kill the seeds in the soil. And that's not true. They are not sterilants. They're applied to the soil surface. They are taken up. They're incorporated. You can physically incorporate it, but ultimately you're going to need moisture, whether it's rain or whether it's irrigation, to basically dissolve those chemicals and move them into the soil solution. Because then what happens is you have your developing weed, your developing plant, it takes up that herbicide that's in the soil solution either by the roots or the shoots. So, but when do you do it? When do you use your pre-emergence herbicide? And the easy answer is, well, before the weeds are up. But it's more complicated than that because all weeds are not created equal. And this is where I've stolen Brian's data from a paper that he published this year. So yes, we're going to apply pre-emergence herbicides to the soil. And yes, they need to pretty much go down before the weeds become established. Now, there are some products out there that do have those burn down capabilities. Think about like Reflex, Goaltender, right? They have pre-emergence activities, but they can't burn down some small weeds. But also understand the spectrum of the weeds that they might control pre-emergence versus post-emergence doesn't always line up. The matrix label is actually a really good example of that. Some of the weeds listed pre-emergence are not listed post-emergence and vice versa. So anyway, weeds have different times that they emerge throughout the season. We have some early emerging species like common lamb's quarters, common ragweed, and then later ones like some of the pigweed species or common water hemp is in there. So you need to know who is there so you can time your applications to be sure that you're in advance of those emergence windows. Now, again, when you're going to apply depends on what species you're targeting. But what if you have species that have germinate at different times? You have giant ragweed and common lamb's quarters and pigweed and, giant foxtail, and you just have this range of emergence windows. Or maybe you have a species that just emerges very long throughout the season. So that's where maybe you're using sequential timings, where you're using a residual herbicide, and before that residual herbicide completely breaks down, you're putting another residual herbicide out on top of it to extend the window of that control. But understand, it's also going to be very dependent on the crop. We're talking about this weed-focused strategy of using pre-emergence herbicides. When do I do this for the weeds? But it's also going to depend on the crop you're going, because you got to make sure that that residual herbicide fits into the crop at an appropriate timing, because you don't want to do damage to the crop, and those pre-emergence herbicides can't do damage to the crop. Just because they're meant to act in the soil doesn't mean that they can't cause physical damage to the above ground tissue that they contact. I've seen situations where dual magnum can burn. I've seen dual magnum cause fusing of some meristematic tissue and cause deformations. You've also got to make sure that there's, again, the efficacy. You need to be able to get it down to the ground, making sure your crop is at a stage where you can get good soil herbicide contact. And then you also just have to think about the residue standpoints, and that's a residue from your legal obligation when using the herbicides, is you can't just put these out whenever you want, because there are timing issues associated with the legal and safe use of the product. So just want to show you something about the power of pre-emergent herbicides and where they're exceptionally valuable. I don't know how many people grow beets, but beets don't have a lot of herbicides to use. They are slow to get out of the ground, especially slow relative to the weeds. The weeds can get up And so having pre-emergence herbicides really gives the beets a chance to get established, and you don't have to rely on post only, which can be limited in beet production environments. This is another example of some pre-emergent herbicide use, untreated versus going post only, and corn using a pre and a post emergence combination. And just look at the difference. You can see the difference in the drought stress here. This was from last summer in July. Having that pre-emergence weed control, being able to suppress the weeds at an early stage to minimize the crop weed competition. Much better, like both the pre-post and the post only, they don't have any weeds, but one was dealing with weeds for, was dealing with a weed-free environment for a lot longer than the other was, and it matters when it comes to yield. Just wanting to note the variability in the spectrum of control. I know it's going to be hard to see, but for the Prowl H2O, we've got no lamb's quarters, but we've got some common ragweed here. We've got yellow nutsedge coming up. Dual magnum. Here's the ragweed a little bit. Here's some lamb's quarters, but no nutsedge. Also wanted to point out is that we don't think about pre-emergence herbicides as being effective against our perennial weeds. But there are some that do have activity, and dual magnum on yellow nutsedge is one of them. Also, field bindweed. Work I've done in California is Treflan actually has some suppressive activity on the field bindweed and able to suppress some of those perennial vines. Just like with your annual species, timing is key. You've got to get the Treflan down and incorporate it before those vines start to get out of the ground. Now, residual herbicides aren't going to last in the soil forever, and there's a lot of factors that are influencing their breakdown, just like Brian had talked about a half-life. Herbicides have half-lives as well, and there's a lot of different activities that are reducing the concentration of those products in the soil solution. And not all herbicides are acting the same way in the soil. For something like leaching, I'm much more concerned about atrazine being a leachable material than I am Treflan. But with Treflan, I'm worried about photodegradation if it doesn't get incorporated properly. Volatilization, products like clomazone and losing clomazone. So moving on to the post-emergence herbicides. Again, when do you use them? Well, it depends on what species you're targeting. The species need to be physically present if you're going to be using a post-emergence herbicide. They've got to be there to do the work. But they also need to be at a stage of development when they are sensitive control. And my go-to is the smaller, the better. We don't want to be dealing with very large weeds when we're going in with our foliar herbicides, especially if we're relying on contact products. So again, also very dependent on the crop that you're in. Now, just like we talked about before, you're going to have communities. Some are, and they're going to have these different windows of emergence. So some species are going to get up earlier, and some species are going to get up later. So how do you manage that? Again, sometimes the option is using sequential treatments to ensure that you're going to get weeds when they're most sensitive. Now, I've seen there's a lot of delaying applications. Well, I can let more weeds come up. I can let more weeds come up. I can get them all at one time, and it's gambling because you're running that risk of not getting adequate spray coverage on those weeds due to shielding or having weeds that are large enough to regrow following your treatments. And then there's selection pressure. The more weeds we have and the more we leave, the more likely we're going to find the weed that's resistant to the herbicides that we're applying. All right, so problem with waiting for post control. I'm going to use Palmer amaranth as the example. This is Palmer amaranth. It's about 8 to 9 inches tall. And I think this was about 10. This was a picture that was out in Illinois, maybe 10 days after emergence. So, the labels say, make applications by 3 inches or make applications by 4 inches or 6 inches. The problem with waiting for post control, especially if you're dealing with a species like Palmer amaranth, is it's going to grow faster than you imagine. Palmer amaranth can grow an inch per day. So how fast do you think it's, how quickly do you think it's going to grow? If you start delaying, well, I'm gonna delay, 7 days, I'm gonna let more Palmer get up, but now you've got Palmer that's already 4, 5, 6, 7 inches tall. And then you're just running the risk of not controlling, many of them, the tall ones and the ones that are in the understory. I'm gonna skip these. This was just some work with volunteer peas. Talking about perennials, timing also matters with perennials, and not all perennials can be treated at the same time. So this is work going into maybe Chuck Muller's book or looking at the CAL's website and really understanding when perennial weeds are going to be sensitive to control. So for instance, Canada thistle, clopyralid in early spring before it starts to bud, or in the fall when that new vegetative tissue is up before first frost. That's a good timing. Yellow nutsedge, that 3 to 5 leaf stage with a secondary emergence going in when there's 3 to 5 more leaves. This is a spring to summer application. What you don't want to do is go in after nutlet formation starts in late summer because you're not going to get effective control. Field bindweed, you go too early in the season with field bindweed, it's got a root system going 30 feet deep in some situations. You're not going to have enough above ground material to capture the herbicides you need to control the root systems. In summer and fall with a systemic product like May Roundup, that's when, a flow of mobile, that's when it's moving down to the roots and when you want to be controlling it. So just notice that there's different timings for different species. You can't treat them all the same. This is just some work that Brian also did, talking about, we're talking about herbicides and when to apply, these treatments based on the weeds, but understanding that herbicides are used within systems and maybe you can shift your system around as well. Instead of just saying, oh, okay, I'm just going to plant my crop at one time and I'm going to deal with it in these different strategies. Maybe you can shift your crop later or earlier to manage the weeds. Maybe you can double crop, you can have a fallow, maybe you can have a short season crop that you can put in there. So don't just think about the herbicides, think about the system as a whole. Now, herbicides are not always effective for lots of reasons. You're wrong herbicide, you don't put out the right rate, it's not at the right spray volume, you're not using the right additives, or there's other spray solutions, weeds are too tall, weeds are stressed. And then there's herbicide resistance. I'm just going to go over this real quick, what we have right now. Herbicide resistance has a fancy definition, right? The easy way is we used to be able to kill it with this herbicide at this rate, and now we can't. It's a genetic change in the plants. So what happens, it's not like a radioactive spider bite. It's not like you spray the herbicide and now the weeds are resistant. The resistance is already there, okay? It's already out there. The way we use the herbicides, that's where we find it and it becomes more extensive in our communities. So in this case, A has a mutation that confers resistance, B does not. We spray our herbicide, A's fine, we kill B off. A sets seed, seed goes into the soil seed bank, like what Brian was talking about. A comes up the next year. We go and keep doing this cycle over and over. Ultimately, we start shifting this population towards all A's and plants that can't be controlled with that herbicide of choice. This is the current status of herbicide resistance around the world. With the United States leading the way with 128 cases. These are the confirmed resistances in New York, according to the International Herbicide Resistant Weed Database. This was all work done by Russ Hahn. These are incomplete records, and we're rectifying that now. I have had a survey go out. We've had up to 200 respondents right now, but I can tell you right now, when I ask people what their biggest problems are, right now, it's the pigweed species. 1/3 are saying it's resistant, 1/3 are saying, and 1/3 is like, I don't know, maybe. But pigweed species are a concern. And then far and away in New York State, horseweed mare's tail. 65% of all respondents said that they had problems controlling mare's tail. And when I asked them what herbicides they were concerned with, 70% said they felt that they had resistance to glyphosate. So these are the current ones that we're working with right now. Horseweed, we've confirmed resistance to glyphosate. We have some resistance to the ALS inhibitors, so first rate and classic. In our apple and vineyards, we also have found paraquat resistance in central New York. So that's the new creature on the block. This is Palmer amaranth. We know we have resistance to Roundup and the ALS inhibiting herbicide, classic and first rate. Palmer, and we also have that in water hemp. Palmer amaranth and water hemp in the United States, however, have populations that are resistant to 3, 4, 5 different herbicides at the same time. This is why we don't want these to get established here in the state. We don't want to bring them into the state. We don't want to bring resistances in from elsewhere. Do I have time for the new technology? I'm gonna go through this super quick.
No, you're good.
Okay, so that's the herbicide portion. All right. So now I want to talk about what's on the horizon, what's coming. And you're probably going to say, Lynn, I can't afford that. Lynn, that's not going to work. It might not. But technology is coming. Technology is shaping weed control, just like it's shaping all other aspects of agriculture. It's coming to the weed control world. And yeah, a lot of this stuff is expensive right now, but technology trickles down. And I just want you to be aware of what's out there and what's coming. And I do have a focus on specialty crops. So there's a lot of reasons maybe we want to be thinking about something other than herbicides. Maybe we want to reduce herbicide use. Obviously, there's injury potential, carryover drift concerns. There's changing consumer perceptions about herbicide use. If you're not familiar with the EPA's work plan towards complying with the Endangered Species Act, I'll be back for another time and we will talk about it because this is going to change pesticide registrations and or mitigation requirements when using pesticides going forward. So Brian talked about the weed zapper, electrical weeding. It's a PTO-driven generator that charges a copper front-mounted bar. And what you do is you drive down your rows and any weeds that get above your crop canopy, they get zapped with electricity, just like it sounds. This is Western New York. This is a dry bean field. This is actually horseweed that got away from this dry bean grower. So he borrowed the weed zapper that Crayer's Family Farms has. It's anticlimactic. Everyone wants arcs and sparks and fire, and it doesn't quite always, it doesn't work that way. But what it does is by giving a current of electric currents, these plants, the flow of electricity generates heat, causes water in the cells to vaporize. When that water vaporizes, it expands, it bursts the cells, plants die. So that's the field. And then this is the field 3 weeks later. And you can see the difference. And actually, if you count these rows, you can see that's where the edge of the 20-foot bar was. And they didn't overlap properly when they went down the field. So they left a streak. They did go back through later and clean up that field. Okay. There's robotic weeders coming out. And this is some work that I'm starting. There's lots of types of robotic weeders out there. Right here, this is my little guy where Brian and I are going to be doing work with it. It's a substitute for this guy. This is a GPS guided automated robotic weeder from the NIO company. It's called the Dino. A lot of use out in California right now. Also up in Ontario, they've got some Dino units. Again, it's basically you set your little fleet of dinos out and you come back later. Stout has got some vision guided cultivation, whereas the Dino is just GPS guided. It's not a smart weeder as much as this. This actually has cameras associated with it. It sees the rows and it sees the plant and it just cultivates between the plants because it's seeing the plant and it's like, okay, that's a crop. And then it cultivates everything around where the crop is. And this is just an example of the performance of the Stout. Here's the weeds. That's the cultivation by the Stout. This is FarmWise's unit. It's similar to the Stouts. Again, it's a vision guided. It's watching, and not only that, it's collecting data on every crop plant out there. and basically building crop maps at the same time that it's going and cultivating between the weeds. This is Verdant Robotics. This is a vision guided sprayer. They're also operating out in California. So what you're seeing right there, that light, that's basically the sprayer targeting the weeds. And wherever that light is, that's a weed that it's spraying. I happen to know the guy who owns the company, and I'm trying to get one to come to New York to test. Then Carbon Robotics, probably the sexiest one on the block. It also comes with a price tag of $1.2 million because it is a laser weeder. And what you're seeing is it's scanning the bed, and you see those little white lights? That's the laser burning the weeds. This is it again. And you can see it scanning. And then all those flashes of light is the laser.
So would that work if you had that UV pressure?
Yeah, so they're finding out right now that the heavier the weed pressure, obviously, the greater the escapes. Right now, this is seeing use in California, Arizona, and there's growers in California and Arizona who have more than one of these because it saves on their labor costs. But don't forget, they're in a drier environment where they don't have that surface, rain. Maybe they're sprinkling, irrigating to get their weeds up, and then they're on surface drip, right? So it makes sense out there. But anyway, this is an example of what the laser weeder does. You can see there's the weed, there's where it burns, there's the weed, and it burns the meristem. We are looking at some stuff in perennial crops. We're looking at an electric weeder, and we're looking at a vision guided sprayer. My electric weeder is much like the one I talked to you about here, is the PTO driven generator. And then this is like a front mounted deck. It looks like a mower deck. But what it has is these are my electrodes, okay? And it's just brushing over the weeds on the surface and applying that electrical current. This is work that Marcelo Moretti did in Oregon. Here is Italian ryegrass. And then here's the Italian ryegrass 4 weeks after treatment. This is one of our bare ground, just our weedy fields here in New York. These are ongoing trials in hazelnuts, grapes, apples, almonds, and blueberries, looking at a lot of different factors. One thing I can say is that so far with the electrical weeding, we have found no effects on soil microbial activity or soil microarthropods. So there is a potential for soil health conservation component here. And then just bring in that row crop targeted spray technology. This is my vision guided sprayer. Bringing this into tree and vine systems so I don't have to keep putting out a banded application. Can I just see the weeds and spray the weeds under the canopy? Thank you very much.
Have any burning questions?
No. Yeah, I just have on the half-life of pesticides, where would you get that information on pesticides?
So there is a book out there called the Herbicide Handbook. You can get it through the Weed Science Society of America. It's a little pricey. I think it runs about $70, but you can get an online PDF version, I think, for $35. Now, it's an older issue. They're going to be redoing it, but it has not only all that half-life information, it has vapor pressure information. So how likely something is to volatilize or not. It has all of the information that they used for like toxicity to different organisms. And it talks about like say half-lives and vapor pressure under different environmental conditions. And it gives the citations for the articles that it used to build all that information. It's a great book, I recommend it. A Herbicide Handbook, Weed Science Society of America. So there is So apparently, where it grows, native to in the southwestern United States, it has been used for edible you know, the seeds have been collected and eaten. I'm gonna tell you right now, we are not gonna eat our way out of Palmer amaranth. And the females have very sharp bracts associated with the flowers. And harvesting the seed is not pleasant.
Is there some sort of a?
So, yeah, so the electric weeder, actually in Europe, Rootway has a handheld version where you can just, you know, like a cattle prod, you can just sap your wheat. They will not sell one to me. So, they simply will not sell it. It does exist. But yeah, so the work that I've done with, I'm assuming you're meaning taking out raspberries, not. Oh, you want to control raspberries? Yeah, so raspberries have like no herbicides, yeah, they are difficult to control. We have not explored. Yeah, that I haven't looked at, like, say, the electric weeding yet in those systems. We're moving into blueberries, which would be our closest approximation this year. So Marcelo Moretti, so far has not had issues. The unit I showed you though is big. I had to get one for a coffee plantation because with supply chain issues and COVID, you take what you can get. There's a possibility of getting a much smaller unit that only needs a 22 horsepower tractor, that I think is going to be better. I'm trying to get my hands on it.
Very good, thank you.